name's Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. Now, this is a show called Insight, and we usually discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes we'll talk about historical books that provide some perspective on the present, and sometimes sort of broader atmospheric books that provide a general setting. Today's book is on domestic politics, addressing voting issues. It's written by Kathleen Jamieson. She's associated with the University of Pennsylvania. And the title of her book is called Everything You Think About, You Think You Know About Politics and Why You're Wrong. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Drew Strohecker. To Drew's right is Jessie Basler. And to Jessie's right is Maria Sanchez. So I wanted to read a brief opening quote from the book, and then you get a sense of where the author is coming from, and we can jump into a discussion about it. She writes, "What does the public know about politics, and how does it know it? To assess the impact of news, ads, and presidential debates, we interviewed 8,850 respondents in 5 large-scale surveys. Some of our polls were single one-time snapshots. Others watched the public over time. Taken together, the material we gathered from these interviews provided the most comprehensive profile ever assembled of presidential general election campaigns and their impact. Some of the results surprised us. Many assumptions and beliefs ran counter to conventional wisdom about campaigns and elections. In this book, we share our findings." I should point out to the audience, this is not a current events book, that it was written back in 2000, so 18 years ago. But on this show, we don't necessarily want to do current events books. Sometimes you want to find a book that provides some fundamental ways of looking at any election. And so there's a number of things that transcend the time period when the book was written and still matter now, and so that's why we're using the book here.
So the book, I think it starts out a lot on media and how the media can distort our view of how politics work in the United States. It starts out talking a lot about how the Clinton and Dole campaign.
This is 1996.
Right.
Yeah.
Went back and forth about how they used attack ads against each other and how those ads, influenced how the American public looked at the campaign.
I think in this book it's important to understand that this is a very small survey population versus the entire United States. It is from the thousands. I think it very vastly covers a lot of different aspects of politics, and especially how we go through presidential elections and local elections, but it does contain media and attack ad information. But it is only 8,000 people, so when we come to statistics like this in political science, it's important to understand sample size, where the sample comes from, and the time period it's related to, as well as how things are framed. So from my point of view, I'm taking the information with a grain of salt because of the sample size, but I think it does cover a vast amount of information that we need to know.
To address that last part of the quote in regards to conventional wisdom, there's this idea that campaign matters in shifting voters. However, the book shows that it does not produce that large effect. It reinforces voter expectations, but not always an unexpected outcome, as generally thought out to be. It is more rare than anything. If campaigns that actually produce a significant outcome, it would be more common to see large amounts of voters assume ideologies that are in complete conflict with their own ideologies.
Yeah, I would say the book in no way is trying to identify liberal or conservative media bias. That's nonsense, and a lot of that stuff gets overblown. We can identify it in small ways, but the assumption that absolutely everything in media, that incredibly broad umbrella term, falls into that category isn't true. She makes a good statement. She says, "The media may not be successful in telling us for whom to vote, but they are stunningly successful in telling us whom we can choose between." And so that as a result, one of the ways you start looking at this is that a lot of people can throw their name into the ring, And there's sometimes so many candidates, say, in a period running for president, that some of them just get sidelined inevitably by the media because you can't cover everything. And so the process of their elimination, that's not necessarily to say, oh, we're not going to cover you because we think you're conservative or you're liberal. That's nonsense. Sometimes it's more other issues. Entertainment plays an important role in some of this.
I think when I was reading it anyway, especially about the primary election chapters, it talked a lot about how the media will get together and a few small groups of reporters will actually decide who the frontrunners will be for the entire campaign and sort of select those people out to give them more coverage. So I mean, that really gives a way of showing who is going to be the frontrunners in any primary campaign. If you get more media attention, you're obviously going to pull ahead.
I think when I read this book, one of the things that I was thinking about was how Donald Trump had an advantage in the Republican primary in 2016 because you ended up having 19 candidates. And so because you had so many that most Americans had no clue who the other 18 were. And so as a result, my feeling would be that if you only had a very few candidates, he would have stuck out in a different way and maybe been presented differently. And so oddly, even though Trump may sort of feel the desire to constantly attack news coverage of him in any way under the sun, often because it doesn't come across looking like the tabloid coverage that he had when he was in New York and sort of a member of celebrity status, that as a result, they actually helped him propel him towards the White House.
I mean, the media has a huge influence on these elections. Statistically, in these surveys, it has a minimal effect model, which is basically how it relates back to reporters and how they perceive candidates is how they present them to the public. In this day and age, and especially in the early 2000s, TV is the first way that we learned about politics. If you weren't involved in politics, if you weren't political scientists, that's how you got your information. And so the media can frame how we view politics, who we view as politics. So yeah, going back to this primary election that we had with so many Republican primary candidates, the idea back to it was the hidden effect. So as visibility goes up, that's how you're more likely to get support because people have to know your name to vote for you. And the more that they see of you, the more likely they're to support you or dissupport you. And so relating back to Trump, for example, he was very public in the media. He would attack the media, so then the media would attack back kind of thing. And so more visibility, more name recognition. The other ones kind of got pushed to the wayside by that. And so we do learn in this book and in general political science categories that the media has an effect on it. Like you said, that a few select people in the media can select who is going to be the front runners just by visibility, who they report on, and they're going to choose whoever gives them a good story. No one wants to sit here and listen to boring politics that have statistics and evidence, but they'd rather have something that's showy and flashy that they can run on their daytime TV over and over and over again.
Yeah, and it's very important that the book does a great job addressing is that the media not necessarily influences the way people vote, but it influences what to think about. Right. The media's influence is significant in that term because we look at Hillary Clinton and the Trump election. We see Hillary Clinton's scandal was drilled and drilled and drilled until the end of the election, whereas Trump's scandals, they were, I would argue, short-lived. And that's a significant thing that the book addresses is what the media does in influencing what we think about, not necessarily how we vote.
Yeah, again, because this book is written way before either one of them was sort of on the radar screen for running for president. And so as a result, here we are taking ideas from this book and applying them to a recent election. And certainly the notion of a simple liberal media bias or conservative media bias, that the primary thing is entertainment, and that you end up seeing that you're trying to keep your audience or attract a larger audience, and you got to do so knowing that somebody such as Trump is of entertainment value to the news, and that as a result, they did help him.
Yeah, we can look at other, not just campaigns, elections, issues like the Yemen crisis, one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Yeah, it's not covered because it's not entertaining. People don't want to watch graphic pictures of babies and children starving and warfare. They don't want to watch that. So the media chooses not to put that in their agenda.
And media perception can kind of alter how we view these politics, and that was going back to the conventional wisdom that they're trying to address. Most people think that politics are very nasty and attacking now and very flashy and it's all for show, but it's not necessarily that way. It's the way the media portrays it. The media is not going to report on them going into detail about nuclear triads and the facts behind that. They're going to show when candidates attack each other, when they call each other names, when they do something flashy. So perception of politics in the general public is altered. That way, typically people think that, the media is showing us these attack ads and this violence, and they're thinking, oh, politics is just, mudslinging now. But it's not. It's just how the media is perceiving it, and that affects political turnout, political voting, and how people care about politics. If they view it just as nasty, aggressive attacks, they're not going to be interested.
And going back to the entertainment value of Trump, I mean, when the election first started in the primaries, everyone kind of thought that Jeb Bush was going to be the front runner, and when you put Jeb Bush and Donald Trump next to each other on the stage, you're obviously going to get 10 times more of an entertainment shock value just by itself out of Donald Trump than you will out of Jeb Bush. And I think it's situations like that the media give more attention to the people who are going to put that kind of a shock value out.
I know that there were numerous studies that showed that Trump didn't have to spend as much money on campaign TV advertising because TV essentially covered him a lot more than they did other candidates, and so as a result, it was essentially the same as paying for campaign TV ads, and so the idea of him not sort of thanking who helped him get to the White House instead of them sort of biting the hand that fed him, so to speak. And so, yeah, the book spends time sort of, you go through and she has a question, says, do campaigns matter? And she says the conventional idea is maybe not because you're only swaying a very small percentage of the voters, but then she's saying, yeah, they do matter because of the fact that as the campaign progresses, you have, and she says, candidates tailor their messages and images to the media's requirements, her quote. And so as a result, as you're going through this, you begin to make adjustments. And so the adjustments sort of matter. So you're changing in the course of the campaign, being aware of how you're seen on television, how you're being presented on different channels. So the campaign does matter.
Campaigns are massive enterprises. I think the general public that's not super interested in politics views campaigns as ads and stickers and voting signs and little rallies, but it's a lot more than that. Media plays a huge role in campaigns, as well as how public perception alters, commercials, everything from reactionary rallies like we saw with the Women's March movement after Trump's inauguration. It's all an aspect of politics. I think campaigns aren't very limited. They're very massive enterprises. And so they do matter. They really do. And we've seen this in the book. It was backed up by all the studies that they looked at, is that campaigns matter because it's a whole aspect of our community, of our culture. It's not just political ads and handing out flyers and things like that.
She also in the book talked about the idea and said, do politicians keep their promises? Which I thought was an interesting section in the book because she says, yes, they do. And she says that you can't measure it as 100% because of the fact that you're in a complex political process, and so as a result, you're going to have a president interacting with Congress, and Congress can neutralize a lot of what you're doing. So sometimes to measure keeping your promise is that they're still pushing for something that they want, as opposed to necessarily succeeding, which implies if you say success, it's like, well, then Congress doesn't matter. So that as a result, you can't look at it that way. And she spends a great deal of time, and I thought it was interesting because she's saying the media kept presenting at this time frame Clinton in the White House as not keeping his promises, when in fact his record of keeping promises was on a par with any other president, but the perception was the way it was presented.
I agree. The issue with this is that a lot of people think, well, the president's going to get in the White House, he's going to make all these changes really quickly, and everything's going to work really fast. But that's not how it works at all. The president has to present these things, Congress has to deal with it, and it's a very, very slow and arduous process. And so when the media reports like, oh, this isn't happening, it's only been a few months since they've got their presidency, it's extremely difficult to make things happen in our government system currently. And so the media perceives either a good president or a bad president, and that's how the public's going to perceive them because that's the only information they get. Most people don't go through, Senate roll calls to see how people are voting or look at all the president's accomplishments that they've had. So for that, I think it's definitely a public conception, but it's also because the media bias. There's technically no media bias, but how they present whether this president's succeeding or not. But in the statistics, we found that nearly every president keeps the majority of their promises, or at least is making an effort to keep their promises, whether or not they're actually fulfilled by the whole process or not. The presidents typically do what they're going to say they're going to do.
There's also a campaign strategy the author mentions of politicians keeping their promises, and that's providing vague answers and being ambiguous as a campaign strategy. As the book states, it causes voters to vote for non-policy candidates to later learn their preference of how they vote or how they view certain policies. You can easily translate into Trump's statement on the LGBT community. During his campaign, it was very vague and ambiguous on where he stood, but now as president, we can see his administration clearly on what his policy preferences is. Just this first week of October, he blocked visas for same-sex couples of the UN employees, and we see where his ideology is translating, but during campaign, it was very ambiguous of where he stood.
I thought when I was reading that part, as we're taping this, Justice Kavanaugh has become Justice Kavanaugh, so now a member of the United States Supreme Court. And so television news was presenting it as a win, and look at that, Trump got a victory. And I was thinking, well, he was going to get it anyway. It really didn't matter, even if Kavanaugh's name was, let's say, withdrawn, or Kavanaugh decided to withdraw his name himself. Trump would have proposed another judge somewhere, probably on a federal court, to become the Justice of the United States on the Supreme Court. And so he would have gotten that one anyway. So the idea of calling it a win doesn't really make any sense because you were going to have it one way or the other. And so the idea of, no, we're going to keep Kavanaugh off, and that I'm not sure what you thought you were going to get in place. Suddenly, the liberal justice you want, it's not going to happen. So the image was always presented in the wrong way, and the way it's being defined as a victory on TV seems very odd.
And in light with Kavanaugh, there's going back to how candidates say their messages. The hearing of Kavanaugh has sparked a lot of media attention regarding sexual assault survivors, and media are using that issue, and candidates are backing off on the issue as promoting for the midterm elections. They're running on that campaign of being supporters of sexual assault survivors, and that can potentially impact voters this midterm election.
I definitely think when it comes to the Kavanaugh thing, there's multiple facets to it. It is the media coverage. It helped the victims of sexual assault come forward to protest that, send petitions. People called their legislators in Congress to kind of change things. I think that what people were thinking when they didn't want Kavanaugh was not to have a conservative judge. We knew we were going to get one. It wasn't any misconception that Trump would ever elect a liberal candidate. The idea behind it is the judiciary is supposed to be moderate, unbiased in politics, but it's very, very difficult to have that, as most of the judges have had a life in politics and law. We weren't expecting to not have a conservative judge. We were not expecting to have someone who's been accused of sexual assault who is so clearly biased in their reports, in their hearings. He was very biased, he was very political, and he was very openly conservative, which is typically not accepted in a judge, but also because the history of his sexual assault allegations, we weren't expecting someone like that to be a judge.
Yeah, I just think his approach to it was all wrong, that he should have approached it differently. One, he should have never gone on Fox News. Once you do that, you're being pinned a certain way, so he shouldn't have agreed to go on TV news, period. And then when he did his presentation and made it look as though there was some dark conspiracy run by the Clintons, it was very odd the way he made a presentation. And then Susan Collins, when she justified voting for him, a senator from Maine, she was asked whether or not she believed his accuser, and Dr. Ford, and she says, well, she believes what she says, which was a very odd thing to say. And so I'm going to wonder if there's going to be any sort of backlash either in the upcoming congressional elections of 2018 or in a presidential election in 2020. It was just presented in a sort of odd way, that it's sort of like the ends justifies the means. We're going to, any way we can, we get our guy on the court. And it just was presented in a very strange sort of a way.
I think, especially looking at appointment of Supreme Court justices, I mean, can't think of any instance where one of them ever got denied the bar for that. But
So now there was some other issues. They talked about the whole notion of the idea of attack ads. And even though people complain that they don't like attack ads, well, they do.
It draws
It's sort of
attention.
the theme of
So
the book.
definitely, attack ads are very cruel and common, but they can hurt the political process. Is most people believe, oh, they're just mudslinging, I'm not going to pay attention, but you subconsciously hear it whether you're listening or not. The attack ads, it kind of makes you distrust candidates and things. So the book actually breaks down very well. So they separate it into 3 categories of political efforts. It's advocacy, which is where you're trying to promote your personal policy and agenda. Attack, which are the clear attacks on your candidate or other policies. And then contrast, which is where one candidate presents a policy or a position and the other one contrasts it. So the book found that contrasting ads were more likely to gain support if they saw both sides of the argument and they were bent one way. But attack ads, while they are very aggressive and slightly offensive, they work.
Yeah, and so if you ended up looking at the idea of how it was broken down, attack ads are fine. Different types of attack ads mattered, and others didn't. And so you started this, but on television, when it's presented, it's sort of done in a very simplistic way. All you do is say, they did an attack ad, and you leave it that way. And so as a result, you're trying to sort of look at the idea of, would be nice to see on television that maybe they didn't use quite simplistic language of simply calling everything an attack ad.
I found it really interesting how voters were really well informed of these 3 categories, because I myself wasn't really, there's an in-between one too, not just attack ads and just pro for their ideologies, but there's an in-between, and I think a lot of people fall into that because it's so hard to distinguish whether it's an attack ad or something pro my ideology, and that was really interesting to read in the book.
And I think what was also interesting is that the surveys kind of studied whether or not the attack ads were true. A lot of people, especially my family and myself involved, is that when you see an attack ad, you're like, is this actually true? Or are they just taking bits and pieces to like demote their candidate, potential like competition? But for most of the part, the statistics found that in the surveys that they were using facts. They were using actual knowledge based on these attacks. They were just wording them in ways that seemed very aggressive, and that's a hard thing for the public to distinguish. And so we typically just take things at face value, especially with media and commercials. Whatever we do, we just listen to whatever they're saying, and we're like, oh, no one's going to go and do research to find out if it's the truth or not. But this survey actually showed that for the most part, they are telling the truth.
And it's just so important to consider the images they use in these attack ads. Like if you look at a lot of very aggressive attack ads, it's very powerful, very like demanding of the candidates, making them look evil in a way, just not welcoming. So that's really interesting.
the book also talked about how there are different like categories for attack ads also. There is different kind of responses from the audience as to what kind of attack ad is used against other candidates, and it talked about how personal attack ads are looked at as very unfavorable by the public, and they enjoy attack ads that actually bring substance from a candidate's actual agenda.
There was a quote she had in the book which I thought was odd, because now this is 2000, the book is being written, but it sort of addressed Trump. And it said, the cost of incivility can be high, and voters will hold that against a candidate. Well, you're thinking, here's something that now this election has run so contrary to that, the 2016, and while Trump has been president, he's certainly acting in ways that no previous candidate or president has acted. I'm not sure whether people can walk in his footsteps and do that, because again, Trump seems to be of a different type of a nature, because you knew what he was like on TV. It's sort of like, I remember that Leonard Nimoy, who used to play Dr. Spock on Star Trek, he talked about the idea there were certain types of roles he could not play, because once you're sort of pigeonholed into a certain category, you have to stay in that vein. And so to some extent, you had a preconceived image of how you saw Trump from TV. So as a result, it's acceptable because almost a broader public has been preconditioned to see him a certain way.
Definitely,
Whereas,
the media presents him in a certain way, and he fulfills that advocacy. And so it's important to know that once that's clearly accepted by the public, he's president now, that behavior is not going to change. If people aren't like punished or reprimanded for negative behaviors, they're going to continue the behaviors. And I think Trump saw it as the public liked that he wasn't a standard candidate. They liked that he said whatever he thought, even if it was offensive, and he's going to continue with that because that's what the public liked. That's what the public supported him for. That's why he won the primary and then he won the general, is because they liked not having a standard politician, because as we've discussed in this book and the surveys, that most people don't like politics. They don't really care. They don't want to deal with the whole process. They find it arduous. So it's one of those things that he knows how the behavior is accepted by the public, and they're going to continue that. And it's a vast candidate thing, not just Trump.
She had one little section in the book. It was about do women know less than men? And it was an interesting thing. She was saying that when you do surveys, and it's sort of like fill in the blanks, let's say, and it's a written one, that more women than men are more likely to leave something blank, whereas men will fill it in. And so she wondered whether or not just that process meant that those sort of quizzes or tests or knowledge samples meant men knew more than women. And so she drew a conclusion that yes, men do know more than women in a generic sense, but then she talked about why. And her why was that men are more likely to discuss politics among each other or between each other, whereas women are not. And so what I'm wondering is, again, because this book is written 18 years ago, whether or not there's been, to some extent, a change, that when I'm thinking of sexual assault allegations, suddenly that gets raised to the level of you are discussing it within a political environment. So suddenly you are talking politics, and so whether or not in that situation the level of knowledge comes up.
This chapter actually stood out to me so much as I was looking through. I skipped to that part of the book before I started actually reading the book, so I found it very interesting. So the first thing to go into is her statistical anomalies that she found in these surveys. She found that men were more likely to guess even if they didn't actually know the answer, and women were more likely to leave it blank because they said they don't know the answer. Why would they put something down? Which is where the discrepancy comes from. And it's also a cultural issue. We treat the binary gender from female to male and everywhere in between very, very distinctively. So the idea back that this is written in the 90s and 2000s is pretty accurate, that less women were involved in politics. It wasn't really our place to be. It even currently now is very, very skewed towards male behaviors, just because, you know, if you look at the origins of our government and politics, women weren't allowed in those spheres. So it takes a long time. It's an arduous process to get women involved. And so when it comes to these politics, that's typically where you see the statistical discrepancies, is that there are more men than women in politics. I don't think that's to say that women know less about politics. They know just as much. They're just less likely to be involved in political discussions, to run for office, and that's changing. And we see that now in the last couple years, is that more women are running, more women are voting. There's a higher turnout from both.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so let me go through what you think of this book, and do you recommend it for people watching the show?
Okay, so this book was very, very data heavy. I mean, it had statistics. I mean, the whole book was statistics and the data from all of the surveys that they took. And if you're into a book that is very data heavy, then this is going to be great for you, because it does a great job of displaying that data to the people that read the book. I enjoyed it from that kind of a standpoint, where it had a lot of information that you can use, but you do have to sort of realize that you're going to slog through a lot of information to get there.
I think this book was effective in covering a lot of different aspects of politics. I think that you do need a history in political science and statistics to actually understand it and comprehend it, because it is very data heavy. But overall, I think it is a good book. I'd like to see a modern version covering the last election.
Yeah, this book does a great job of showing how politics are ideally perceived, but shows how it is in reality. As stated, I do agree that it does need some intro to politic system or statistics, just because I even sometimes find myself looking up these political terminologies and refreshing on my statistic concepts to understand the book more clearly.
Yeah, I like the book, but I do think it is sort of a heavy read if you're just looking for something to give you a background, but it can be very helpful to provide you with a necessary background. So thank you for joining us today.